Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Doctors Manitoba's webinar on vaccine hesitancy. We appreciate your attendance tonight, and we have a great expert panel who's going to guide us through this topic tonight, and then we'll be happy to open it up for discussion and questions. I'd like to start by just alerting to everybody to how to participate and engage in tonight's webinar. The chat function is only really used if you're having technical issues, so we'd encourage you to use the Q&A box to submit your questions. Some questions have been submitted in advance, and we'll get to those after the presentation, but we also welcome live questions as well. I'd like to turn things over now to Dr. Corey Bailey, the president of Doctors Manitoba, to introduce the session and our panel. Dr. Bailey.
Good evening, colleagues. Thank you for joining us this evening. We have an esteemed panel of physicians and researchers who are going to present to us this evening and enlighten us about vaccine hesitancy and COVID-19. We have Dr. Michelle Driedger, who's a professor and researcher with community health sciences in the Rady faculty at U of M. She's an expert in communicating health risks, including engaging patients about the benefit and risks of vaccines. She's appeared regularly in local media during the pandemic and has active research underway now to understand the public's views on COVID-19 and immunization. We also have Dr. Jennifer Potter, who's a family physician and an assistant professor with the Department of Family Medicine at U of M. She has a research interest in vaccine hesitancy, and Dr. Potter will help us take the theory and apply it in practice. We also have Dr. Amila Heendeniya, who's an infectious disease specialist working in all 3 acute care hospitals in Winnipeg. He's a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, go Huskies, and attained his infectious disease certification at the University of Toronto. He's a strong background in new and emerging COVID-19 vaccines. We also have Mr. Andrew Swan joining us. He's Doctors Manitoba's General Counsel, and he'll be on hand to answer any questions you have about your professional obligations and any liability issues regarding COVID-19 vaccination. So our agenda for this evening, Dr. Driedger and Dr. Potter will speak on vaccine hesitancy. Then we'll follow it up with discussion about COVID vaccines from Dr. Heendeniya. And following that, we'll have opportunity for roundtable discussion and questions that were submitted in advance and also submitted this evening. I'd just like to take a minute here to speak about Doctors Manitoba and the pandemic response. You can see here on the slide a number of the areas that Doctors Manitoba has been working on during the last almost a year now that we've been dealing in the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly most recently, our most acute issues have been dealing with COVID-19 vaccination and working to help involve physicians in the vaccine rollout. We're also involved in working with Manitoba Health on pressing for a more comprehensive plan to address the backlog in surgical and diagnostic procedures, and hopefully we can make that a reality as the numbers of new COVID-19 cases and the number of patients who are hospitalized in ICU gradually declines. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Driedger and Dr. Potter for the first part of our discussion this evening.
Here, I just need you to be able to allow me to share the screen.
All right, you should be able to now.
There we go, and hopefully slideshow will kick in. There we go. All right, well, thank you for having me here today, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking with colleague Jennifer Potter. And just to kind of start off with, I have no kind of financial conflicts of interest. All of the research that I'm going to be talking about today have been funded either by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Social Sciences Humanities Research Network, or the Canadian Immunization Research Network. We're here talking about vaccine hesitancy, and often when we're looking at vaccine hesitancy, it's viewed as kind of a binary issue. People, will accept vaccines or not, but it's not quite so simple. People's approach to vaccine decision-making, you'll have that spectrum of people will either refuse all or they will accept all vaccines, and they're pretty confident in their decision-making and in their choice. In the middle of that spectrum is what we refer to as the movable middle. It's all of those individuals who either refuse, but they're unsure about the decisions that they're making. They'll accept vaccines, but they're equally unsure if that's the right thing to do. Or there will be some kind of, I'll take some vaccines, but I won't take others. And in the area of like childhood immunization, there might be some decisions to not necessarily follow the scheduled recommended immunizations. So there'll be some decisions to delay. Now we know within the clinical environment, it's never just the physician with the patient sitting across from them. In any of those conversations, it might be what the patient brings in from things that they've read within the news media or they've heard on social media. They might also be bringing in questions from things that they've encountered from more credible sources of communication around immunization, but equally, they might be motivated by some information which might be confusing or conflicting with other things that they've seen being promoted by alternative vaccine perspectives. And in those environments, there will be a lot of vaccine misinformation and disinformation being shared. And certainly in the case of COVID-19, there's going to be a number of people who will actually go read the product leaflets from the websites of the different vaccine manufacturers to try to get a better sense of what are the possible harms or benefits that are faced with those vaccines. So there's all of those competing communication environments within that clinical encounter. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to give you a very quick journey across 10 years worth of work within the area and only being able to bring in some select highlights. During pandemic H1N1, I had an opportunity to do research both with general population in Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Toronto, as well as with Manitoba Métis. And while you don't typically in qualitative research quantify people's responses, one of the things that we aim to do to understand people's decision-making factors when they were ultimately deciding whether they would accept the novel H1N1 vaccine or not. And even though it was an influenza type vaccine, there was an adjuvanted form of it being introduced. So that was something that was new and caused a number of people moments to pause and make decisions as to whether they would accept it. Overridingly, for general population Canadians, if they had a strong recommendation from their healthcare provider, if they were regular flu vaccine acceptors, and if they felt that they had a higher risk associated with the pandemic, they were much more likely to accept the H1N1 vaccine. By contrast, for those people who regularly didn't get the flu shot, they viewed the vaccine risk to be far greater than any risk associated with exposure to H1N1 virus. And they also generally felt that there was, not sufficient knowledge on which to make a decision. Now contrast this with Manitoba Métis. Again, the persuasive factors were if they had a strong recommendation on the part of their healthcare provider, and if they also felt that their pandemic risk was greater, they were much more likely to accept the vaccine. But because in Manitoba during the H1N1 pandemic, there was a prioritization, particularly in the earlier rollout of the vaccine distribution, for anybody of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis ancestry to be prioritized to receive the vaccine first. So that prioritization was actually met with considerable distrust. And we're already seeing elements of that within COVID-19 prioritizations, at least with respect to First Nations communities. Equally important is that a number of these citizens also viewed the vaccine to be a far greater risk than the disease itself. And if we remember back to H1N1, while there was an impact, particularly in the first wave within some northern Manitoba First Nations communities, by and large, Indigenous communities were not hit quite as severely as we're certainly seeing now with COVID-19. In a different survey, national survey of Canadians, and this was of Canadians, parents with children, and we were looking particularly around childhood immunizations and decisions that people made around acceptance of vaccines. One of our questions was around trust in institutions and people. And from here, you can see that even then, 89% of our participants had very strong trust in their physicians. In a more recent study that we've done, we know that the communicator matters, but it also, the content of that communication has an equal importance. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this research was to look particularly involving only parents, so this was a national survey of parents with children under the age of 2. And we wanted to see what impact it would have for them if they were exposed to a communication. It was framed in terms of a mock news story. All of the content was the same between the 4-story conditions, but we wanted to see if it was communicated by a physician versus communicated by another parent. Likewise, if the communication was more emotional, so a story of decisional regret, versus a more deliberative, here are the pros and cons associated with vaccines. And in this particular study, it was a before and after study design, and we were really targeting individuals who had received had measured with some level of hesitancy. And that was measured using a validated scale of the parental attitude for childhood vaccines. So if we look at this continuum of vaccine acceptance, anybody who had a score of 8 or 25% or higher was invited into the story, into the intervention arm. Now, ultimately, what we found is that people's attitudes were fairly strongly predictive pre and post. And that's not unlike kinds of encounters that you might be facing when patients come into clinic. But what we did notice was that there was a lot of support for shift within that movable middle. Those parents who were vaccine hesitant, but they had lower vaccine hesitancy scores overall, there was greater shift towards vaccine acceptance following exposure, even as simple as a 550-word news story. So there is support for that investment in that movable middle. In some other recent work that I've been doing with some colleagues, we've been looking at migrant and refugee experiences with childhood immunizations in Canada. And this has been with newcomers who have been in Canada for less than a year to newcomers who have been here from 1 to 5 years. And overwhelmingly, there was an almost universal trust in vaccines on the part of newcomers and a wish to be very compliant with what is expected within Canada. But that trust was somewhat fragile if they did not actually receive recommendations by physicians about vaccines, or even sometimes when patients would come in with questions. I think sometimes physicians might feel, oh, I might have a vaccine hesitant parent across from me, when in fact it might just be they have some questions, they're more used to a different kind of educational strategy from their home country. And so they actually prefer to have those strong recommendations. There was also a desire to comply with those Canadian requirements, but there was oftentimes a lot of confusion about what the vaccination schedule was like. And again, from home country experiences, they were used to situations where people would reach out to them saying, it's time for your child to be immunized. Whereas their experience in Canada has been, they have to be following along and they don't exactly know what they should be following. So there's sometimes opportunities lost opportunities for education. And I just want to kind of share one of these quotes from Nigerian participants in Winnipeg, and it revolves around that lack of not feeling that they're getting a strong physician recommendation. So this one mother is talking about, the doctor comes in and says, today it's the vaccine, and the mother laughs, yeah, I booked the appointment. The doctor explains, this vaccine is this, you may want to take it or you may not, it's up to you. But that leaves a lot of room in your mind. Doctors need to lead with assurances that you need to have this thing, as opposed to just making it, something malleable. Or like another mother was saying, with immunizations, if it's important, don't make it wishy-washy. Get in people's faces, unless it's not that important. And what really blew me away out of all of these years of doing research with members of the public is that these Nigerian women had a really advanced understanding of immunizations, how vaccines work, vaccine preventable diseases. And so I asked one of them, you know, when you hear the word vaccine hesitancy, which I wouldn't normally do within a focus group, introducing a jargon term like that, but I said, what do you think that means? And the one woman said, is that when the physician's hesitant to give you the vaccine? And now if we kind of flash forward very quickly into two very recent polls in Manitoba that were conducted, one by Prairie Research Associates and another by the Winnipeg Free Press, who commissioned Leger. Both of them within a 1 week period of each other, polling about 1,000 Manitobans asking about their willingness to get a COVID-19 vaccine. The scale was a little bit different, but ultimately, depending on how you want to look at this, of focusing on the definitely wills or probably wills, or if you want to look at that middle ground, what would be referred to as the movable middle, that 25 to 36%, that's showing that there's a fair amount of need for some form of communication that people might be coming to clinic and seeking your opinions on. We also did a series of focus groups with residents in 4 different cities, and these were age segregated. So we wanted to understand how people were talking about their intentions, particularly around COVID-19 vaccines. And we had also conducted a survey with these participants just to kind of get some sense around vaccine acceptance. And it was interesting that about 87% had very strong intentions towards acceptance of a COVID-19 vaccine prior to our focus group. But then during the focus group, that percentage had already dropped down to about 56% in terms of how they were responding to questions and how their thinking was changing. And even some of them had commented, you know, originally I was really strong in my choice, but now I'm not quite so sure. But when you start to delve down into where that desire to wait and see what's actually underlying a lot of that, there were very strong sentiments around feeling that the vaccines themselves had been rushed and that they hadn't been tested enough. And part of that was signaling that there is not a strong understanding on the part of Canadians or Manitobans in how vaccines are actually authorized and approved within the country. They also wanted to know if there were adverse effects that would be experienced. And so they kind of wanted to watch and see how particularly early priority groups fared in receiving the vaccine to know if it would be sufficiently safe enough for them to get. They also wanted to have more information. And there was a lot of concern about long-term safety associated with COVID-19 vaccines. And there were also some interesting questions that were being raised around whether these vaccines would be effective against new variants. And keep in mind, this was done in December and only some of that was starting to be heard in the news. We're hearing a lot more of that now. And there were also some participants that had a greater fear associated with the risks associated with the uncertainties of the vaccines compared to the risks associated with COVID disease. And in those participants, they often felt that, well, you know, I'm pretty young and healthy, so if I get COVID, I'll probably fare it okay. But these vaccines, I'm not too sure. So in terms of kind of giving a few take-home messages of what do you try to do with all of this and how can it help guide communication in those clinical environments, particularly with respect to COVID-19 vaccines, what we're seeing so far is that there's going to need to be that strong, empathetic, and affirming communication. So not simply being told that, you know, it's safe, but acknowledging that, you know, that's a valid concern. It makes sense that you're worried about that. I mean, these are novel vaccines. Here's how it's been accounted for, and here how we're continuing to monitor for would be useful ways of leading into those conversations. And again, if you feel it is appropriate, knowing everything that you do of the patient who might be sitting across from you, seeking your opinion around whether or not they should be getting COVID-19 vaccines, if you feel it's appropriate that the vaccine would be safe for them, you know, after your conversation, if it still seems like they haven't made up their mind, it might be useful, you know, to acknowledge that, but then to at least end with a strong recommendation for them of, you know, for what it's worth, I would recommend the vaccine for you. Similarly, communications and messaging needs to be very layered. And part of that, you have to take the cue from the people that are sitting across from you. So one of the kind of versions is to think about it as to whether you're just going to give them a quick bite. So you give a bit of information and you see if that might satisfy whatever the questions are. And if they start asking more questions, well, maybe you need to give them a bit more of a snack. So you add a few more details depending on the nature of that conversation. But you might also know that you have a patient sitting across from you, and from your history with that patient, you know that you're going to need to launch into the full meal deal. So you want to start being prepared for a bit more of a fulsome conversation. But we know within research around cooperation with particular recommendations in clinical contexts, physicians generally are well trusted because there's often a good past history. There's an established relationship between the patient and their physician. And this is often easier for physicians who have much more established practices. But it doesn't even take that long for patients to develop fairly quickly a sense of, yeah, I can trust this physician, or I'm not too sure. There also needs to be a strong sense, an expression of shared values. So if the patient on the receiving end of that communication feels that your recommendation is ultimately in their best interest, it's in their best health, it's not out of some motivation of, herd immunity and population protection, then that will go a lot farther for that individual patient. And now I'm going to turn things over to Jen.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to build on what Michelle has said. So, I mean, first of all, vaccination is a procedure, and just like any other procedure, we have to do it with informed consent from the patient. This is a legal and an ethical obligation, of course, but it is also an opportunity to build that trust that Michelle was talking about. By going through, the pros and the cons, you're demonstrating that you're not just blindly following recommendations. You've thought it through, and that's an opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain and let people know that, hey, medicine isn't really secret knowledge, right? We're not purveyors of secrets and things that we can't share. So you kind of have this opportunity to say, yeah, here's how this works, and here's why I think what I think. You do want to go through the risks, but you also want to provide perspective on those risks while you're doing it. It's not really enough to just sort of list off, the things that are in the product monograph. You also have to sort of put a little bit of context to it. So, talking about things like, here are the common side effects, things like a sore arm or a mild fever or feeling a bit unwell. Those things are fairly common, but they're usually fairly mild. They don't usually last too long, and you can take over-the-counter medications, which helps with some of those things. Versus here's some other risks that are more serious. So things like, anaphylaxis and that kind of thing. But those are very, very rare. Those are more like 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million kind of risks. That's more like being struck by lightning or winning the lottery. These things the risks aren't zero, but they're really very low. With COVID specifically, one of the things you might want to acknowledge is the fact that we don't have long-term data on it. We have lots of, we have studies with tens of thousands of people on these vaccines, but we don't have, what happens to you 5 years out with these things, because they just haven't existed that long. So, acknowledging that and but also providing the perspective that if you're going to have problems with a vaccine, you're almost certainly going to have it, shortly after the vaccine, within hours to days, weeks at the outside. So, we're based on our experience with other vaccines, you probably don't need to be worried so much about the stuff that could come up 5 years out. And then the other thing is not just to talk about the risks, but also the benefits, right? So, you're not really vaccination is a binary decision. You choose, yes, you get the vaccine, or no, you don't. So, a lot of people kind of come in with the idea that if I choose not to get the vaccine, I'm choosing the safe thing. But that's really not the case. And pointing out that, choosing the vaccine is basic, or choosing to turn down the vaccine is basically choosing to take your chances with COVID. And that's not, the safest choice. Could I get the next slide, please? So, how do you have these conversations with people? And Michelle kind of touched on sort of the broad themes there, but kind of getting to the nitty gritty of how you do it. motivational interviewing is kind of our best guess at what's going on. There's the amount of evidence out there in terms of what really works isn't great. There's sort of, there's the studies like Michelle talked about and things like that, but we don't have a lot of like RCTs describing exactly, the best way to talk to people, or at least not that many of them. But motivational interviewing is sort of a common way that we kind of try to help people make good choices. So you start off with kind of, get the lay of the land from the patient. What have you heard? What are your concerns about? And then you want to kind of reflect them back to the patient, so the patient knows that, yeah, I hear you and I understand what you're talking about. And like Michelle said, validating, I understand why you're concerned about those. Now, if patients are bringing the concerns they have are come out of like misinformation, for example, vaccines causing autism, you do want to correct those misconceptions, but you really don't want to go into it in great detail. And the reason is that, from psychological literature, our brains really like stories, and we like stories that fit together, like a jigsaw puzzle. We like those puzzle pieces to kind of fit in there nicely. And so people have come into your office with some kind of vaccine story in their head. They have some kind of understanding of what vaccines are about and how they work, and whatever that story is, wherever they got that story, that's what they're coming into your office with. And so they have this vaccine sort of story and puzzle already pre-assembled. And if part of that is a misconception, and then you sort of contradict it really blatantly, what happens is it's like trying to take a jigsaw puzzle piece and jam it in where it doesn't fit. And our brains don't really respond well to that kind of thing. We respond to that actually as if it's a threat. And so what happens is if you take this really contradictory information, to what this jigsaw puzzle is already, then what happens is that people, they tend to, it requires a lot of cognitive energy to make that piece fit into their understanding. And a lot of people will just sort of say, you know what, nope, I'm going to just reject that information altogether. And then you probably undermine that trust that you're working to build. So really, when you're talking to somebody, if they've got some misinformation, you don't really want to say that's not true. You want to sort of you want to correct it a little bit more gently. So something like, well, a lot of people are worried about autism with vaccines, and because of that, we've done a lot of studies, and we have a lot of information on that now, and we now know that we don't really have to worry about that. And then, as quickly as you reasonably can, you want to kind of get over to the benefits, right? You want to focus on, because presumably you're having this conversation. Part of that puzzle that people have in their minds about vaccines is that, in some level, vaccines are good. And so you want to sort of build on that. So you want to focus on the benefits. So things like, even healthy people have problems with COVID sometimes. So, let's make sure that you're protected. Let's get the benefits of these vaccines. Next slide, please. So, you've gone through that. Like Michelle said, a clear recommendation to vaccinate, assuming you think that's appropriate, is a good way to end that conversation. Now, some people are going to say no, even with all that. And that's, it's not necessarily a failure on your part. It just means they might need a little more time to sit and figure out that puzzle. So you do want to keep that conversation going. No today is not necessarily no forever. So the next time they come in, you might want to say something like, well, we had that discussion about vaccines last time you were here. Have you thought of any further about that? And if they say yes, or they're interested, I would strongly recommend that, if they're there for some other reason, but, they're interested in the vaccine and they're willing to do it, I would just get it done. Even if they're there for a sprained ankle or something completely unrelated. If you have the opportunity to get the vaccine in the arm, I would definitely recommend that you do that. And that's what I had to say. So I think I'll go back to Michelle.
And just a very couple of quick conclusions of really everything that we've been talking about, and in terms of approaches to vaccine hesitancy, there is no one size fits all approach. And hopefully through some of the things that we've provided, we've given you a little bit of wiggle room between those proverbial rocks in a hard place when you're faced with some difficult questions at times in the clinical encounter. And I'll turn it now back to Keir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Driedger. I think we have Dr. Heendeniya up next. And are you also looking to share your screen, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, so you should be able to do that now.
Perfect. Okay, those are two very excellent presentations from Michelle and Jen. I learned a lot. I don't personally deal with a lot of vaccine hesitancy in the infectious diseases group. A lot of my patients tend to be quite okay with vaccines, given they have gone through a lot of infections. So really, this is about the COVID vaccine. You're going to go through a lot of science in a very short period, but the reason we are doing this is so maybe you'll have some basic understanding of what's coming down the pipeline and what's already here from the pipeline. So you have a basis to talk to your patients about when they bring all those questions. So I don't have any disclosures, no financial ties at all. Just a quick timeline to put things into perspective. December 31st, 2019 was when WHO, when I first got the email from IDSA saying there's a cohort of pneumonia in Wuhan. And then January 11th, we had the genetic sequence for the SARS-CoV-2. By December 2nd, we had the mRNA vaccine approved in UK. So it's a very rapid timeline. We did not think it'll get this fast. You guys might remember they were expecting 18 months for the first vaccine. So what was the difference? The traditional timeline for a vaccine, as you can see here, is 10 to 15 years. Very slow, a lot of different steps. And you do big animal studies, small human studies, bigger human studies, massive human community study. So what happened with COVID-19? We saw the need for a vaccine right away because as we saw the disease progress going from country to country, as you saw on the previous timeline, we had the need to get something going fast. So if you can see what the vaccine trials did, they kind of overlapped those multiple steps. They started the government and the regulatory body conversations early. They were very open with each other, so they shared each other's research. So this kind of expedited things. Now, this does not mean that anybody dropped any of the safety, necessary safety standards, at least in the trials that we have been following. If anything, the number of participants that we had in the COVID vaccine trials have been way more than the previous vaccine trials, because there were a lot of people that had the interest in joining the trials. Also, there were billions of dollars that went into this because we saw the healthcare needs with the COVID vaccine. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there were really no corners that really cut in the production of the vaccine that so far has been approved for circulation. So just quickly going through the different vaccine types. If you look in the left-hand side, these are the ones that we are usually used to. Now, there are COVID-19 vaccines that are under trials right now that are live vaccines, inactivated viruses. And the more commonly used one, the recombinant conjugate protein type of vaccine, those are also in trials. And then there's the toxoid adjuvant vaccine and the DNA vaccines. On the right-hand side are the ones that are coming to Canada and the North America and was already here. So the RNA vaccine, one of the newest technologies that came to light with the COVID vaccine, one of the reasons we were able to produce vaccines so quickly. We'll go through this mechanism in a bit. The two big ones are the Pfizer and Moderna, as you know. And then we have the two big vector-based, adenovirus vector-based vaccines that are what we call non-replicating. That means the virus vector is not replicating in the body. It just produces the protein that we need. And the Oxford AstraZeneca, the one that's big in Europe, and then Johnson & Johnson most likely coming to Canada soon. And the other thing, as you guys know, the Novavax that just we are thinking of producing in the future, not being approved in Canada yet, is a protein subunit nanoparticle vaccine. So those are the three exciting fields. So quickly about mRNA technology. Here you see the coronavirus. We identified the spike protein from that genotyping that happened back in January 2020. You take that mRNA out, you put it in a lipid particle. So that's where the allergy issue a lot of comes in, because we had to stabilize that mRNA vaccine, be able to go into a cell, so we need the lipophilic casing. So that's where the lipid particle comes in, and this has little the pegs, what we call polyethylene glycol. So the biggest chance of allergic reaction would be those pegs, the polyethylene glycol. Then what happens is it binds to the cytosol, as you see, the mRNA goes in, the mRNA goes through the ribosome, it produces the spike protein pieces. 3 pieces together produces 1 spike. It's important to know that mRNA vaccine, mRNA particles destroyed at this point. It's just protein production, and it gets expressed in the cell. which leads to the antibody production, which I put into one slide. This is a very complicated process that happens. Two important points here. This is a completely natural process. As you can see, there's no viral particle in there, just an mRNA that we produced in the lab. And the other thing, it does not get into the cell nucleus. So there's no interaction with the DNA as opposed to some of the myths that's out there. This is not an unknown technology. You might not have known. Moderna actually just came up with the phase 2 trial for the CMV vaccine from the exact same technology. Hopefully it will be available soon. Now, the other big one is this vector-based. So that's where we use an adenovirus that cannot infect humans, whether it's coming from a chimpanzee or a lab-based adenovirus. Again, you take the spike protein, put it into the adenovirus, introduce into the body using the vaccine. So this is AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson. And again, so this one, it does use the cell nucleus, but there's no incorporation into the human DNA. You get the mRNA, mRNA produces the spike protein, as you can see, produces the immune system. Now, the last thing is this is the new Novavax vaccine. This is a whole new technology where they use a very specific virus to produce just the protein particles of the spike protein. And you take the protein particles, put it together, what we call a vaccine nanoparticle, and you inject that nanoparticle into the human, and in the cell, you get the immunity produced that way. So this is the new exciting field that's coming up. So hopefully we will get the vaccinations going here once we get the approval in Canada. I'm going to talk a bit about the efficacy and safety of these different vaccines. Again, very summarized to a very single slide. We'll talk about the two mRNA vaccines. So the issue with the mRNA vaccine, you do need 2 doses as per the guidelines from the clinical trials. Pfizer at least around 3 weeks apart, Moderna 4 weeks apart at most. The efficacy is interesting. Now, both of them quote around 95%, but if you actually truly break down the data, if you look at even a single dose, there tend to be 92% efficacy of the vaccine even after a single dose at 12 days. What we don't know is how long that single dose efficacy will last. And we also don't know how long that dual dose efficacy will last because it's a new vaccine. Safety, on the other thing to note is if you compare the two groups, the vaccine group and the control group, the vaccine group did not have any severe COVID cases. We can't give efficacy for severe cases, there just wasn't enough cases. So hopefully once we get the data from Israel, UK and US, we'll have more information. Safety-wise, there were really no really severe issues with the safety. There were 5 cases of Bell's palsy in the vaccine group for Pfizer and 3 cases in the Moderna group. But when you do the math, still at the level of the normal population risk. So again, we'll have to wait for the real world data and see if we see any few cases. But the actual anaphylaxis was extremely rare. Any reaction that did come within the first 30 to 45 minutes of vaccination. Then we have the Oxford AstraZeneca. Now, this is a bit of a nightmare to go through the papers because of the way they did this lower dose and a full dose. I think that's one of the reasons it's not completely approved in Canada yet. Canada health teams are still waiting for more data from Oxford AstraZeneca before approving this vaccine. They quoted a 70% overall effectivity. What's interesting is the people that got the lower dose tend to have a higher efficacy, and then the full dose had a 62.1% efficacy. So I'm not really sure exactly why that happened. They did note about an 8% severe fatigue headache. That means needed to go get some IV fluid type of severe. There were 2 cases of transverse myelitis. One of them had an undiagnosed MS in the past. The other one potentially from the vaccine, but don't know for sure. Now, Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, those are press releases. We don't have the data yet. What's important to know about Johnson & Johnson is there was a continental difference with the efficacy. In South America, they only quoted a 66% efficacy, and South Africa, 57%. Again, we don't know the details of this, so we had to wait for the data. Same thing with the Novavax, it's 2 doses, again, press release, so I don't have hard data to give you actual efficacy and criticize the data. Now, the variance is one of the questions that's going to be coming up. As you know, anytime any cell divides, there's a unique thumbprint. Same thing with viral replication. You're going to get different thumbprints. At some point, those mutations will be big enough. We call them a mutation or a variant. And some of them can show higher virulence, but overall pathophysiology very rarely changes. So that means the spike protein will always be the spike protein, most likely. So most of our vaccines should offer somewhat of a protection. So what we know so far, at least from Moderna and Pfizer, that the mRNA vaccines tend to have the retained activity, at least maybe slightly lower. But we have seen reduced activity with the Johnson & Johnson, as I mentioned. What's important to know is our immune system is robust. There's multiple different arms involved. Even if you have decreased production of antibody, we should have somewhat of protection to reduce the, even if you get the infection, reduce the severe infection. The same way a flu shot will be effective. Now, there are some random questions that I have gotten, so I thought I'll list them. Can the vaccine give you COVID-19? No. I'm not speaking about the live vaccines. I can't imagine live vaccine coming to Canada while we have all these other vaccine options. Can the mRNA change your DNA? No, as you saw. Can the adenovirus infect you? No, because that adenovirus is essentially a non-replicating virus. Even if they pick a replicating virus, they're not human adenoviruses, so you should not get an infection from the adenovirus. Are the vaccines safe in pregnancy? So there's been issues because all the developed countries have said it's okay, have a conversation with your doctor and get the vaccine if you think you're at high risk now, or even a moderate risk. But then the WHO went and said, if you're not at high risk, don't take it. I do not agree with that. It should be safe in pregnancy. For my patients, at least, I have been having a good conversation and recommending the vaccine in pregnancy. Now, what's the risk of allergic reactions with the vaccine? It's very low, at least from what we have seen. The biggest issue is we really won't know if you're going to react to it because of the lipid coating around the mRNA vaccine. So if you're somebody who has an allergy to that polyethylene glycol, there might be a reaction. So that's why we watch you for 15 to 30 minutes after we give the vaccine. Now, this has been coming up more from the BIPOC community. Can the vaccine contain pork or cow or other animal products, really? So this really comes down to the press release from the vaccine. So far, I could find that the Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca does not contain any animal products in the vaccine or in the production line. The other interesting question that we have been getting is if the vaccine was developed in fetal cell lines. So that's a complicated question. So I'll talk a bit about it. It is, in summary, not used in mRNA vaccine production, but might be used in some vector vaccines. So what are fetal cell lines? These are not actively taken cell lines recently. There's usually two cell lines from the 1970s, one from a kidney cell line, one from a retinal cell line that they harvested, and they're proprietary. They have been using cell lines developed from that original cell lines, over 3 decades ago. So there are no new fetal cells needed for this vaccine production, at least from the vaccines that we know of. In the mRNA vaccines, they did use the cell lines in the research phase for proof of concept because they wanted to see what the human cell reaction would be, but they are not used in production. Now, in vector-based viruses, you need a cell to produce that adenovirus. So sometimes they could be using those fetal cell lines, but they're not actually included in the vaccines. And for whatsoever, the Vatican did say it's morally okay to at least get the mRNA vaccine. So we do have some buy-in from the religious leaders. So there's a list of vaccine trackers you can easily find if you want to know what's the worldwide vaccines are. There's 2 great websites, and all the ongoing Canadian trials are listed on the Canada website. So that's all I wanted to say. So why don't we take any questions that you may have?
Good. Well, thank you to all the panelists for your presentations. We've had some questions come in on the chat and some submitted ahead of time. Why don't we start with a question for Dr. Driedger and Dr. Potter. There was a question sent in that from a public health perspective, what do you think that Manitoba Health or the government of Canada should be doing to address vaccine hesitancy?
Bazillion-dollar question. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to address vaccine hesitancy, but I don't think with respect to what we're seeing in terms of people's attitudes with respect to COVID-19 vaccines, it doesn't match the same level of vaccine hesitancy that we might track within childhood immunizations. So I think a lot of investment needs to be made, though, to help provide appropriate resources to support physicians when they're having conversations with parents, but also having, and patients, but also having materials that are much more accessible and possibly more interactive than what presently exists. I don't know when the last time that the fact sheets were ever kind of updated or incorporating any other kinds of ways of communicating that could be perhaps more engaging, but there are some definite efforts that need to be made. And Jennifer, I'm sure you've got some thoughts there.
Well, you know, I'm not an expert in communication, but I think that, you know, like you say, sort of some public education that sort of seeks to normalize vaccination, I think might be helpful. I think that, you know, that's been done in places like Australia, and I think there was some effect to it. The other things, I think you're right about, you know, things needing to be kind of given a bit of a facelift. I think a lot of what is out there looks a little dated now, and you know, people when they're looking at it might not really feel they're getting sort of the most up-to-date information that's out there. So, I mean, those are two things I can think of off the top of my head.
Thank you very much. Just looking at some of our other questions, anything specific in terms of targeting messaging, either by physicians individually or from government public health sources to the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities when it comes to the vaccine?
Well, in terms of our Indigenous populations, we already have a very strong First Nations COVID response table that's been quite active, but there hasn't been sufficient engagement around with Métis and Inuit. But we do know that when we have Indigenous physicians and Indigenous leaders having opportunities to engage with their communities, that goes a long way. But it's not only just at the leadership level. And so that's what some of the things that I'm trying to do in some Métis-based work in Manitoba is how best do we need to engage with citizens around questions that they might have. And for the most part, it's people who are looking for same kind of information as within general population, but because there is so much historical mistrust within Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, that I think we need to ensure that some of our spokespeople properly reflect the very communities that they are seeking to target. And we need to make a lot of efforts towards trust building.
I would also like to see some more options for dialogue, you know, where people who, you know, they come across something on the internet or, you know, in conversation, and they're not really sure where it goes. You know, if they have an opportunity, an option to sort of seek out good information from a source that they trust, I think that would be helpful as well.
Thank you. So aside from patients who may be vaccine hesitant, how would you suggest addressing a patient who has less concern about COVID itself and feels it's a mild illness, and yet as their physician, you feel it definitely would be in their best interest to be vaccinated?
Well, in my office, what I've sort of discussed with people is you know, they're right. If you're young and healthy, in most cases, people come through it without too many complications. But then kind of shifting into but not everybody. And, you know, we do have a certain number of people who are, you know, requiring hospitalization and you know, having complications, and also having what they're calling the long COVID, right? Where you know, it's a long, slow recovery process. And that happens even with younger people. And in addition to that, there's also the factor that even if you don't get very sick yourself and you don't get complications of COVID yourself, you know, you still are at risk of passing it on to somebody who might be more vulnerable. So, you know, yes, there's benefit for you, but also think about the people, you know, you're really close to. That would be how I would approach that.
Thank you very much.
It resonates with how we heard people talk even within focus groups around the kinds of information that would be helpful for them.
Thank you, Dr. Driedger. A question for Dr. Heendeniya about some of the technical aspects of the vaccines. Looking at pregnancy, was there any, does the advice vary, I guess, in terms of the enhanced consent based on gestation stage?
Yeah, so it really shouldn't. As you saw, at least the vaccines we have so far, you shouldn't have any effects on the fetus. The issue becomes, as you know, if you have the first trimester morning sickness, or if you have a hyperemesis gravidarum in second trimester, and then the third trimester, obviously they're a lot more uncomfortable. I don't know how many of you have had the vaccine. The second dose can make you sick. You can get myalgias, fevers. So you do have to let the person know if you are pregnant and you still recommend getting the vaccine, but they might have some worsening symptoms that they'll have to put up with. That's the main issue, but there shouldn't be any other contraindications unless we see something specific in the new vaccines coming down.
Okay, another question about vaccine hesitancy in the chat. The question is saying that a lot of people who are vaccine hesitant are that way because of an emotional feeling or reaction, and often fear. And the questioner says that he or she doesn't feel that they respond well to facts. How do you recommend addressing patients whose fears may be coming from a more emotional level?
Well, I think you're right. I think a lot of people don't respond well to facts. This is not, in many cases, not a knowledge gap problem. So, and a lot of it is driven by fear and concern and worry and uncertainty. So yes, you absolutely have to address the emotional side of it. My suggestion is you want to kind of understand where they're coming from and where their fears lie. You want to build that trust, let them know, you hear those fears and validate them, like Michelle said. You probably, if there's blatant misconceptions, you might want to gently correct them, like we talked about. But really, I think you want to understand their vaccine picture, the puzzle that they've built in their heads, and you want to try and give them information that kind of supports the benefits, but that still fits within that puzzle that we talked about. So, things like, can you help me, understand your fears, and then can we talk about, sort of some of the other, fears you might have on the other side, and focus on some of the benefits as well.
Yeah, and the only thing else that I would kind of add to that is the emotions drive a lot of it. People always say we need more information. They're looking for facts, they're looking for citations, but they don't necessarily want to get down to that level of detail. At the same time, we know within psychological based research that you appeal with facts, but we're driven by those emotions, and the easiest way of trying to change behavior is trying to make the path as easy as possible. And sometimes those fears or those reluctance might be because of, access barriers, or it takes too long to go get there, or they don't want to have to be waiting in line. And, there's all of those other things that will creep in that might be used to justify why they may choose to accept or not getting a vaccine. So as much as we can try to make the pathway as simple as possible, oftentimes it's also possible to work around some of those fears and emotions with our facts and guidance.
Thank you. A question, I guess, and it was answered a bit during the presentation, but just to expand on the rock and the hard place that we heard about. And I want to bring Andrew into this conversation. It does sound like physicians could be between a rock and a hard place between, needing to honor and meet the professional obligations and legal requirements for informed consent, but not offering so much information that you're now planting seeds of doubt based on what we heard from the research earlier. And finding that sweet spot could be a challenge. So Andrew, I wonder if you want to share a few thoughts from the legal perspective as General Counsel for Doctors Manitoba, and then we can bring in some of the other panelists to respond about how they handle that in their practice as well.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kier. And yes, we've already heard tonight, physicians counseling patients on the COVID vaccine will provide a reasonable amount of information to patients to get their informed consent. I would add that it'll be necessary for physicians to make sure you chart what you say, obviously not verbatim, but if there's any discussion that goes in any different way, you want to make sure you put that in your notes. And if someone refuses the vaccine, you'll probably want to chart that as well. I agree with what's been said tonight. It'd be very helpful if public health was more out there with materials that physicians can refer to. We're working with the regulator, with our college, and also the insurer for most physicians on this call, CMPA, to make sure you've got the best possible information in hand before vaccinations in your practice start. And we just want to make sure that the college doesn't accidentally impose something that makes it more difficult. CMPA, if you look at their materials online, are a little agnostic right now, and I think we really want to push them to follow what we've heard tonight, that we want at the end of the day for physicians to be able to recommend the vaccine as strongly as possible. So it's all still a work in progress. We talked about some of the factors this evening, deciding how high you have to set the bar. And so far, we know, first of all, the identified risks of the vaccines seem to be quite limited. Number two, the effectiveness of the vaccines, as we've just seen from the presentations, are quite high. Third, of course, there is no alternative treatment, at least no sane alternative treatment that's medically recognized. And fourth, as we've just heard, the risks of getting COVID and the consequences for the patient and their community are considerable. So those are all things that will be taken into account and should lower the bar in terms of the level of informed consent that has to be given. So as Doctors Manitoba, we're going to keep working to help physicians meet those requirements without overburdening you and without needlessly adding to patient concerns. I just want to add that late in 2020, the federal government announced what they call the Vaccine Injury Support Program, which will be apparently the first line of defense to compensate Canadians, the few number of Canadians injured by a vaccine. Every other G7 country has this. It probably makes good sense for Canada to be on board because this is a public good by getting people vaccinated. Details yet to be worked out with the provinces, but we'll keep monitoring that. If anybody has any questions between now and when you start giving the vaccine, please email me at Doctors Manitoba and we'll do our best to respond to you. Thanks, Kier.
Do others on the panel have any thoughts on this? And just before I maybe open it up, I'll point out that we are at 7:30. I believe all of our panelists are okay to go over time a little bit and welcome attendees to stay on the line because we do have some more questions we'd like to get to. If we don't get to all of your questions tonight, we'll do our best to try and get you those answers and respond to you with those as well. I'd also just like to remind folks to use the Q&A function rather than the chat or the hand up function to submit your questions. Dr. Potter or Dr. Heendeniya or Driedger, do you have any thoughts on what Andrew said? Anything further to add on the rock and the hard place, so to speak?
I think Andrew hit a lot of the high notes there. I think, again, a lot of it goes down to that layered approach, taking your cues from the patient across from you and the questions they have. Obviously, you don't want to be giving them only partial information, but you don't want to be overloading them at the same time. If the questions that they have are fairly minor, and once they're resolved, they're confident in how they're feeling. So it's kind of that bite, the snack, or the lunch meal deal that you might have to engage in depending on the nature of those questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dr. Potter.
Sorry, I would just say I would agree with all of that. And I think, like I say, you know, there isn't, this is the rock and the hard place. And you know, it's a binary decision. And really the evidence is pretty one-sided for most people, you know, that the vaccine is a better option. So I think you don't want to hide anything, but you want to make it clear that you know, the evidence for the vast majority of patients will be on the side of getting the vaccine.
And one of the interesting things that came out of focus groups, even for participants that were like, well, I don't know if I really want to get the vaccine, the minute there was maybe some constraint on an activity that they wanted to engage in, so whether that be able to travel to some destination or even engaging in, sports activities or other kinds of community-based activities, if there was a requirement of vaccination, then any concerns that they had quickly dissipated because there was something else that was intervening in their desire. So understand that when people have concerns, they do have concerns, but even those concerns are malleable depending on their own underlying interest of what they're seeking.
So a couple of quick questions I'll put together for Dr. Heendeniya. A couple of specialized populations. So a few questions about children under 18. Do we expect to obtain any data? And in the absence of data, are there going to be any recommendations about vaccinating those under 18? And then a question about patients with severe allergies. Do we recommend the vaccine to those with severe allergies?
Okay, so the children part will be tough. Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, I believe, are doing trials right now for the age group of 12 to 18. So I think that's the only data we're going to get from the actual vaccine producers. Anything else will be up to the individual hospitals and the communities to do any trials from younger children. I can imagine our National Advisory Committee giving recommendations for pediatric vaccination, given we are not seeing that many severe cases in the peds community. Yeah, so there's no real guidelines other than that for patients less than age of 12. And for the allergies, so good question. So again, it kind of comes down to which vaccination we're talking about. For mRNA vaccine, I think the allergy risk has been quite low. Even with people with severe allergies, we used to say, don't give the vaccine, but that obviously changed after the immunologist actually raised the alarm saying this doesn't make any sense, because just because somebody has a severe allergy doesn't mean you're going to react to this. So really come down to what type of allergy you have. If you have a patient who has severe allergy for multiple different issues with medications, I think that's a good case to run by an immunologist if they really need the vaccine. But until you get the vaccine, you probably won't find out. The best place to look is the ingredient list to see if there's any severe allergies listed there that the patient has. You obviously shouldn't get it.
Thank you very much. A question about healthcare worker vaccine hesitancy. A couple questions about how we should be approaching this, and I'll maybe start myself just by saying that I had a preview of some of the results from a Public Health Agency of Canada survey of healthcare providers. They had a fairly impressive 14,000 person response across Canada. Physicians had very strong openness and intent to get vaccinated. Which really matched a poll we did with doctors over the last month it finished. But for other healthcare providers, that intent to get immunized was lower, particularly with nurses and other professions. So when we think about the healthcare team, is there something different to reassure healthcare workers who might be hesitant about the vaccine than the general population?
I certainly don't know of any studies that would, give us really any guidance on that question. I suspect, from an individual level, the same things, what are your concerns, and, how do we balance the risks and the benefits, and focusing on the benefits of the vaccine is important. And, really doing the work to build the trust, with our allied health colleagues. I think those are going to be very important. I wonder if there's a broader role for perhaps, regulatory bodies, or like Michelle said, external constraints on, requiring vaccination for certain occupations. But I mean, I really don't have any evidence on that.
And just to add to that, again, similar intentions towards acceptance of COVID-19 vaccines a few months ago were similar to what we've even seen around general population, but with healthcare providers. So initially it was like, oh, I don't know, it's coming a little faster than I thought it might. I think in those healthcare sectors where you might be seeing greater levels of hesitancy, it might also be reflecting individuals who might be part of Black, Indigenous, or people of color communities. And some of that also relates to the need to ensure that clinical trials and research studies involve more diverse populations, so that there can be levels of confidence in how things might, how people in Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities respond physiologically to vaccines and effectiveness and other things. That will also go a long way towards starting to build up some of that trust.
A question for Dr. Heendeniya, and I think probably also Mr. Swan may want to voice his opinion on this. So a question from the panel about how do you answer a patient who asks if it's so safe for the vaccine, why do we have such an extensive release form that we have to sign? We never have to do this for the flu vaccine. What's the difference?
Yeah, so I think Andrew can probably answer this better, but I'll tell you what I think is happening. So if you actually go through the consent process that's been going on with the previous flu vaccines, our consent form has changed. We are actually quite familiar with the flu shot. So I think that's why the consent form has changed in the recent past. But this is a whole new vaccine, and every vaccine is different. Also, the consent form, I think, will also change going forward, depending on when vaccines coming forward. The other thing is there's multiple parties involved in coming up with this, the vaccine consent. You know, you have the vaccine production companies who produces their consent form. Then we have our own regulatory body. So that's why you get all those changes. Maybe Andrew has some more smarter things to say.
Yeah, just blame it on the damn lawyers, frankly. No, I can't really beat that answer. I mean, it's a novel coronavirus. There has been a tremendous worldwide effort to produce these vaccines for use very early on, and that's why there's a bit more in the consent form than there has been. So I can't really top your answer, Doctor.
Thank you very much. A couple questions here about the community vaccine rollout. Of course, we joined with government earlier this week to announce that there are plans to roll out the vaccine in the community. The planning is not for the Pfizer or Moderna products to be rolled out in physicians' offices at this time because of the cold chain and just the sensitivity to even shaking or movement of those products. So they are waiting for one of the more stable products like AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson. Some people have picked up on the fact that there may be a perception or a reality that those are less effective than the mRNA vaccines. And so advice for physicians who might get questions about that: why am I getting, the less effective vaccine through you? I want to wait and get the better one from the province. How would you suggest responding to that? Maybe I'll start with the physicians on the panel. This is a tough one. Nobody's started.
It's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to come down to, this is what we have available, and this is what I can offer you. I'm hoping that there will be some guidance on, how different vaccines can be accessed, for people if they really have strong feelings about one versus the other. But yeah, I don't have a better answer than that.
Dr. Heendeniya, do you have anything to add?
No.
Okay. I think what I've heard from some others is the data, while robust and certainly strong enough to support offering the vaccine to the public, the effectiveness of that, we may learn more as it is rolled out more broadly. And I think Dr. Heendeniya even spoke to the complexity of the layered studies used with the AstraZeneca product. And so...
Yes, right. I think we'll have to watch closely what our counterpart countries are doing. We'll have to see the data that's coming from there. I think one of the things I see a few questions, there's a difference between vaccine efficacy and vaccine effectiveness. Efficacy is in a control setting in a clinical trial with 100% adherence. effectiveness is in the real world community. So we might see those changes. We are seeing a whole, for example, the vaccines were never trialed in the long-term care residents, but it's been doing really well in the North American communities where we give the long LTC community. Actually, we had better effectiveness than efficacy in the elderly population in Canada. So we'll see what the real world data shows.
And I think that's really what is going to need to be drawn on, is looking at those global pooled studies of, not just when people start talking even about adverse effects, because they might have heard something about, well, but it was the vaccine in Norway that caused, and then they'll start thinking about that could happen here. Using resources like within Health Canada and the reporting of adverse events, which get updated every week or every couple of weeks, where you can see across the number of doses that have been actually given out, number of adverse events and other things. And it's those pooled data sets that will be very helpful in these kinds of situations, because we're all now part of this global community of population-based guinea pigs.
So a question about social media. Doctors Manitoba put out a tweet in the last couple of days about one physician's positive experience getting the vaccine, and it's got a little bit of traction in social media. What do you think we could do as physicians and as a society to combat social media misinformation?
Unless organizations are going to be investing to the same degree that alternative communicators will do, it's going to be difficult to always counteract misinformation and disinformation, because that's going to be quite strong. But all of the efforts that you do try of keeping content engaging, updated, changing, where there's opportunities for sharing and showcasing those things, that helps. Having a more interactive kind of environment and more frequent kinds of changing of content has better traction for currency and potential for others to start following and retweeting or resharing.
We haven't talked about anti-vaxxers tonight at all. And there was a question submitted. How should we engage people who are anti-vax, and again, very different from vaccine hesitant, where there's an openness or at least a movable middle, as Michelle Driedger called them, but people who really fall into that camp? Is it a lost cause? Are there any tactics that can bring those people back to being open and considering the vaccine?
I don't think it's ever a lost cause, but when somebody is very strong in their opinions, it's very hard to change them. So as much as you can keep the dialogue open and willing to engage, as when they are willing to engage, is the way forward. And I know that Jen will probably have some additional thoughts here.
There's really no magic bullet. When people kind of really get into this view, it's often becomes sort of a part of their personal identity. And so if you're really if you're really sort of trying to contradict that, you're kind of challenging, they feel like you're challenging who they are. And that's really difficult. And that's not just related to vaccination. I mean, that goes with, politics and, worldviews and things like that. So that's a very big question. And I think in many domains, we don't really have a good answer. One thing I will say from a physician point of view is groups such as, Canadian Pediatric Society and similar organizations. I mean, one of the things they definitely recommend is don't boot these people out of your practice. If you kick them out of your practice, the conversation is over. They don't really have any choice but to, go to the internet or go to, places where they may not get such evidence-based advice. So if you keep them in your practice and you keep the dialogue going, at least the conversation can potentially continue. But yeah, I mean, there's vaccine hesitancy is hard. Anti-vax sentiment is really hard.
And it's important, even labels though, like anti-vaxxers, almost conjure up images of people who are science deniers or who are, you know, those kinds of things just serve to run people further underground, where now there's not even an opportunity for dialogue. So as much as possible, you know, even avoiding those kinds of terms, even in our discourse, is important, because otherwise those things can find a way of slipping into casual conversation.
Thanks. Well, it's just past a quarter to the hour. Why don't we give one last question to Dr. Heendeniya, and then we can wrap things up for this evening. We spoke about the pregnant and breastfeeding patients. What are your recommendations for patients who are immunosuppressed or cancer patients who may be on chemotherapy or have just completed chemotherapy? Do you have advice for physicians in the audience tonight about vaccinations for those complex patients where the guidelines from NACI have been less than clear?
Right. So this is what I do. So I'm more than happy to answer that. So main thing to remember, any immunosuppressed patient, the main risk come from live vaccines. We do not have any live vaccines for COVID. So the mRNA vaccine and the vector-borne vaccines should be safe. The issue is if they have HIV, for example, AIDS, not on treatment, so severely immunosuppressed, they might not put up a response as robust as somebody who's immunocompetent. But I would, for my patients, what I tell them is your protection that you get from that, even that little bit of immune response, is better than zero. And those are the patients that cannot afford to get COVID-19 infection. They do really poorly. So that's, it's very rarely I see vaccine hesitancy in this group.
Great. Well, on behalf of Doctors Manitoba, the physicians of Manitoba, and Manitobans in general, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their time this evening. And I'd like to thank the physicians who participated and offered their questions forward, and for taking the time out to learn about this important subject that undoubtedly will have benefits for our Manitoba population. Please take the time to give feedback after the session. And if you have any questions about any aspect of Doctors Manitoba COVID support, contact us at the COVID-19@doctorsmanitoba.ca address. So again, stay well, everyone. Thank you for your time, and good night.